of minutes. Yeah, David, I noticed you're a designer, so you can help me out, please, with a few comments on our website. It definitely wasn't an expert who put that together.
Your website is totally fine.
Yeah, you're being too kind.
Don't sell yourself short.
Okay, so let us kick off. We're just waiting on Marvin to come, that's fine, and other people to join. But we will start. So thank you very much, panelists. Thank you very much for anybody listening in, either now or subsequently on catch up. So we've got up to 2 hours to discuss climate change and responses in Austria, but also more broadly. You know, we can draw it to a close if we exhaust ourselves and have brilliant thoughts and nail it all before then. So we've got some extremely interesting panelists, and we'll introduce them a little bit later. My name is Sam Baker, and I speak on behalf of everybody who's been involved in Walk2COP27, an initiative I will explain in a minute. So what I'll do is just have a couple of reflections about COP27 itself, then talk about Walk2COP27, the initiative. We'll then go into 3 panelists to talk for 4 to 5 minutes about their own perspectives, and then we'll have a discussion. Anybody online, absolutely welcome to ask questions, and I'll keep an eye on those, and I'll ask those of the panelists, and then we'll go to the next 3. So just a couple of reflections on COP27 itself, and the panelists may want to comment on this when it comes to their turn. So I have not been a sort of COP watcher. I haven't been to any COPs previously. I did walk from London to Glasgow for this COP, and the thing I came away with, which was uplifting, was the sense that there were a lot of people coming together to express concern and to think very hard about potential solutions, and people from all walks of life. That's what excited me, and it felt vibrant, it felt dynamic, and it felt full of hope. Of course, when we saw the Glasgow Climate Pact, I think many of us were disappointed, particularly perhaps the people who are less used to, you know, the snail pace of COP negotiations. And it was difficult to reconcile perhaps what came out of that and the great big issue and challenge that we see in and around climate change, in and around trying to constrain emissions, and in and around trying to create a level of resilience in the world with an underlying premise of climate justice. So it was disappointing to say the least, but I'm still, you know, optimistic or enthused or excited by that great groundswell of concern and joint action that I did see coming together. So when we look forward to COP27, as the panelists I'm sure know better than I think it sort of falls into a number of different, the objectives fall into a number of particular areas. And the first, not surprisingly, is the nationally defined contributions. And so under the heading, I guess, of mitigation, we were hoping, everybody was hoping that COP26 was going to be a time where all the countries brought out those plans to reduce their emissions, and that was going to keep us safely within the Paris Agreement of 2 degrees or less. Of course, that's not what happened. There are various estimates out there about what the plans imply, but the one I've seen most frequently is 2.4 degrees. So a long way north of 1.5 or even 2. So obviously we're hoping now then that COP27 people will create or will produce, republish revised plans which significantly address that deficit and bring down emissions. Fingers crossed. And I haven't really heard about how it's doing. I saw a number of 18 only NDCs that have been published about 4 or 5 weeks ago. I haven't seen an update to that, but obviously fingers crossed that maybe people have got them, holding them confidentially, and then they're going to publish them all at COP27. That'd be great. So the second thing is adaptation. So I think there's been a move, certainly more latterly, to recognize that adaptation/resilience is underplayed as a dimension compared to emissions, net zero, et cetera, and all the excitement about trying to reduce emissions and manage an energy transition. So the adaptation piece, part of it is funding. So there is a need to double funding there's an agreement to double funding. And I think that is part of the rebalancing of 100 billion from sort of developed to developing countries. But I think there's also a much bigger question about loss and damage, which is related obviously to resilience, but also things that have been societies and economies that have suffered and that will suffer going forward. And so I think that the doubling, the 100 billion piece, is less controversial and more agreed. The loss and damage, as we saw, it was in Scotland in COP26. There was heated debate. There was more debate earlier in the year, this year. So we're really hoping that Egypt COP27, we really progress against that loss and damage topic, not least because it's the African COP. So, critically important as a principle and a concept, but really important then to get pragmatic, to create a fund and then understand how to then distribute that fund fairly. So that's the resilience part to it. There's plenty of talk about finance, and the 100 billion is part of that finance. So this was something which was agreed in 2009, as all the panelists here will know. It hasn't been delivered upon yet. So there is obviously a backlog, but there's also the need to do that year on year. And so that needs to be pulled out and re-examined. There's private sector finance that was sort of promised during COP26, but it needs to be allocated, actioned and implemented. And then again, back to the loss and damage, that potentially could be, the biggest component of any sort of financing part or solution. And then finally, just to add there, there were some very interesting things, obviously, that came out of COP26 that perhaps weren't part of the formal negotiations, but were more bilateral or multilateral. And so we had, forests, agreements around deforestation and protecting forests. We had agreements on methane and lots of other bits and pieces. And I very much hope that those get pulled out, examined, and sort of pushed forward in terms of implementation in Egypt. So a huge amount to do. And I guess my concern is that it's not quite as easy to see masses mobilizing against COP27 as the way we did it for COP26. It's for many people, it's less accessible, it's expensive, and there are some more constraints on who is represented and what they do. So part of, I guess, our job is just to talk it up, to talk to as many people as we can, to get people thinking about that, important conference that's coming up. And then I think thinking about that every year from now on. It's not every 5 years, which is the big one. It is every year now, which is the big one. So we need to do what we can to keep that top of the agenda. So that's that. I mean, I think that the other obvious massive point here is that part of the optimism coming out of COP26 is the idea that, we had that groundswell, and that groundswell would build and build and build, and it would all be super exciting, and you get the politicians aligned and online. But unfortunately, we've had a bit of a bowling ball through the skittles, as we know. And one of those is the impact of COVID that we don't really talk about so much more anymore. But the supply side impact of COVID was very significant, and on its own, I think probably would have led to fluctuations in energy prices, massive supply side shortages, etc. That's been overshadowed, obviously, by the war that we're seeing at the moment, and thoughts with all those who are suffering as a result of that directly. But that's created huge geopolitical tension. Some of the things that were exciting about COP26 have been rolled back. So, for instance, the China-US agreement. But of course, it's also brought energy security to the fore. And so now we see countries talking about energy security and using that as a justification or a reason, a rationale for then reopening the concept of, oil and gas, be that new exploration, even coal. So we're seeing that in many countries, particularly in Europe, and certainly in England. You may have, or the UK, you may have seen, we've got a new Prime Minister. One of the first things she's done is put oil and gas licenses back on the table. She's put fracking back on the table. And she has a minister in charge of that ministry talking about extracting the last drop of oil from the North Sea. So this is something we really couldn't have foreseen at COP26. We just couldn't even imagine it. So there are challenging things as a result of that contextual, as we've seen, and we all know that. And part of the aggregate backdrop is, of course, that we see emissions continuing to rise in a decade where we were hoping that we were going to halve them, which would imply, whatever it is, 7%, or no, less than that, but it's probably more than that now, but it was going to be 7% at one point every year, a reduction to meet the 50% by the end of the decade. We're actually going up. And not only are we going up, but actually the emissions resulting from coal, coal burning for energy production is actually increasing as well. So many challenges. But I think that and I'm sure that when we listen to you, our panelists today, it will be enlightening to hear your perspectives, but it will also be enthusing and inspirational to understand how seriously people are thinking about it and what they're thinking about. So just to walk to COP27 very briefly. So I am casting around for something, I've been in business for many years, and I'm casting around for what I can do to contribute in a small way with a bunch of other people. And one of the things that we wanted to do was to create something which allowed us to learn and other people to learn, create an opportunity for us to feel a sense of solidarity, cross-country, cross-demographic, cross-type of organization. And then the third is to make connections. And Walk2COP27 has created that vehicle, certainly for me, but I hope also for many other people. And so what Walk2COP27 is, it's got 4 component parts. The first is getting as many people as we can to walk, run, cycle, or travel in a wheelchair. So you get on an app, you sign up as a team, you clock your kilometers traveled, and then we will plant trees through the Jane Goodall Institute in Burundi as a result of that. But the main point there is that hopefully people come together, talk to their colleagues, their friends, their family about what they're doing. That's an opportunity to talk about climate change, to talk about what they're doing about climate change, get them into a team, and then hopefully integrate that into local or corporate events or organizational events or whatever else they're doing. So for instance, we've got the Lebanese Mountain Trail Association doing one of their hikes and inviting others to join them as part of this, as an example. So that app bit is important, and it's sustained from the 22nd of September through to COP. So we're getting people on that. The second part of this is a series of town hall meetings, this being one. And the idea of a town hall is basically sort of noisy, people shouting out, possibly disagreeing. And that's the sort of idea that we want to have. So lots of dialogue, not sort of too many presentations. So apologies for too many words from me now, but that's the idea of the town hall. We have got 12 town halls. This is number 6. And we head south after this. So we're going down. We've got 3 in the Middle East. We've got Hungary, Bulgaria, Jordan, Turkey, Lebanon, and then down to Egypt after this. And we've come from Scotland. So that allows us to imagine we've got this sort of virtual journey going on. Hopefully there's lots of learning for the different national contexts. The third thing is Clubhouse. So we use an audio-only social media platform and allow people to get on that and talk about whatever climate perspective they've got. So very much anybody listening, please have a look at that. Look on the website, put your hand up, lead a session, and we'll all benefit. And the final thing is just to bash stuff out on social media. And what we want to do on that social media is promote and amplify all these amazing things that other people are doing. So to do that, we've got to be reasonably substantial. So there's a bit of, obviously promotion of Walk2COP27. But the point is trying to give people the opportunity to leverage what they're doing. That's the key point. So without any more words from me, other than to say thank you again to the panelists. And here they are. So thumbs up if you can see that properly. Yeah, Laszlo, yeah, good. Okay, so the panelists and I guess my sort of summary, and you will introduce yourselves and explain your perspective, but sort of my summary and my excitement to listen to what people have got to say here is that we've got a really broad mix here of perspective. So we've got David. I mean, obviously Fridays for Future, incredibly powerful as a movement. The voice of youth is so important in this issue. So very much interested interested both in your journey, if you like, but also the impact that you think you're having. Harald, thinking very hard about business and particularly small and medium-sized enterprises, which is so important in Austria, and how they're dealing with this and what they're thinking about when they think about the climate crisis. Jasmin, representing Greenpeace, and certainly, in the UK, but also in if not every, but many other countries, Greenpeace is so fundamental to mobilizing against some of the challenges, and certainly in the UK, mobilizing against the new Prime Minister and against those things I've just mentioned. So Laszlo, in terms of Passive House, so I think a solution whose time has really come. So Passive House has been around for decades. But it offers, at least in part for a sector, a significant promise of a solution to part of the challenges we face. And so I think it's a really interesting dimension. Marvin, you are obviously representing not just youth, but not just Austrian youth, but more broader in your role as well. I think really fantastic to have people like you making the UN listen to your perspective and your country's perspective. So we look forward to hearing about that. And then finally, Pauline, who has had a number of different roles in the past, including policy, but is also the founder of Klimates, which we will hear more about later. So thank you very much. And what I'd like to do is to start then and have David, then Harald, and then Jasmin talk. So lay out your perspectives, and then we'll do a little bit of Q&A, and then we'll move to the next three. Okay.
All right, thank you so much for the introduction. Great to be here. My name is David. I'm an activist at Fridays for Future Austria. I was fortunate enough to attend COP26 in Glasgow, and this was my very first COP. I was there for 2 weeks. Those are 2 very, very different weeks. I spent the first week on the streets with activists from around the globe, mobilizing, protesting, organizing. And I spent the second week inside of COP, attending negotiations, talking to politicians. And on the train ride back home, as you can imagine, from Scotland to Austria, you have quite a lot of time to think, looking out of train windows. And I realized that actually the first week, weirdly, felt much more impactful than the second. Even though the second week was the one that I spent inside of the conference, the first week, where I organized with activists from around the globe, felt like we had such greater impact. And I think partly that's due to that being the first COP, and I was sort of astonished by the snail pace you just mentioned that these negotiations travel at. But also, of course, because we can look back at 26 COPs now that have really failed to meet the central goal, which is to limit global warming and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions on a global scale. But why is that the case? I think most importantly, it's the case because the national policies that are then agreed upon when all of these world leaders travel back home from wherever they meet every single year simply aren't up to speed with the science on the climate crisis. And Austria is very much a part of this problem. We're missing a so-called Klimaschutzgesetz, which would be a climate protection law on a national level, for over 600 days now. And it's a law that the conservative green majority that leads the government agreed to enact when they first came into power. And it would be a law that would include sector-specific emission reduction goals, because as we all know, and as we have learned from 26 COPs, pledges and goals are all nice and well, but they don't really are useful if we don't have a plan on how we can get to net zero, for example. And the net zero goal for Austria is 2040. But of course, the problem is no one really knows what the pathway should look like to actually reach this goal. And this climate protection law would be our way of putting into writing what this pathway should look like. And ideally, it will also include fines and sort of emergency contingency measures that would be put into place if certain goals aren't met. And ideally, we would also, of course, have climate protection at a constitutional level so that we can go to the courts if politicians fail to act according to the science. But all of these things aren't happening. And I think this is sort of a symbol for what's wrong with climate politics at a global level. Is we have these climate conferences with all of these pledges, all of these wonderful words put onto paper. But when the world leaders travel back home and it's about actually acting on these goals and keeping the promises, we simply aren't seeing the action that we need to see. And so I'm really looking forward to discussing this with all of you today, and seeing what might change for COP27 and what needs to change here in Austria, for us to not let the climate crisis escalate into a climate catastrophe. Thank you.
David. Harald?
All right, thanks. Yeah, just introduce myself briefly. So my name's Harald Wieser. I'm a researcher at the Austrian Institute for SME Research. SME stands for Small and Medium Enterprises. And well, my main focus is policy making. So I look at mainly Austrian national policies in the area of sustainability and climate change, circular economy. So we do evaluations of those policies. We look at policies from the past and look from the outside and make assessments whether they are impactful, whether they are effective, whether it's good value for money, or whether there are more effective measures out there. So those are usually some programs, for example, that fund research for sustainable technologies, for example. So that's one thing we do, and sort of the other pillar of my research are studies where we look at things happening on the ground, what our business is doing, for example, and what can we learn from that? What kind of policy needs do emerge from that, and how can policies be implemented to support, but also give a bit of direction to what businesses are doing. So that's my main sort of perspective on it. And I think David has just mentioned the key issue. it's the lack of climate regulation. That's probably the one thing, single big thing that is missing in Austria at the moment, but it's in preparation. So we will see what's coming out there. The issue in Austria is that its emissions have been more or less stable for the past 30 years. It didn't make much progress at all. And as well, it's not just emissions; it's also resource consumption, for example. And we see huge differences across domains. In Austria, it has made a lot of progress in the energy domain. So, like, for example, renewable energies are pretty, well established. Which, to be fair, Austria it has a lot of water, so that's a bit of an easy starting point. Still, I would say energy efficiency and those kind of issues around energy are really is an area where Austria is really one of the leaders worldwide, I would say. The big problem is mobility in Austria and resource consumption. But what I'm observing in policy domain is that there is, I would say, a bit of a move to go beyond energy. Like in the past, it's all been focused on supporting the energy transition. But now we're seeing focus shifting slightly towards material efficiency and resource efficiency more broadly. It remains an efficiency perspective, but it's definitely broad, I would say. So it addresses consumption more broadly rather than just looking at energy use. So I think that's a very positive a shift in my view. It makes much more ambitious policy. The other thing about Austrian climate policy, I think, is that so in my view, there's two different approaches to climate policy. One is you can support bottom-up innovations, so through subsidies, through research and development, stuff like that. So you kind of pick the most promising innovations and you try to diffuse them as fast as you can. Passive houses is a great example. Austria is clearly a leader there in this area. And Austria is really, really strong in subsidizing all those kind of innovations. Austria is a very strong sector, as a business sector for environmental technologies, and they are exporting quite a lot. The big problem is that those sort of green businesses, they're really classified as a sort of the green sector. There's just a couple of percentage points of the Austrian economy. so even though it looks big, and Austria can pride itself for having this strong sector, the reality is that most businesses really don't know what is happening in terms of climate change. That's part of the reality. So a lot of businesses, it may not be ignorance, but it's just a lack of knowledge as well, and lack of expertise how to implement things. There are many issues we can talk about later, but the thing is, there's quite a huge gap in terms of reaching the masses. So what I mean is that Austria is very strong in subsidizing innovations, but where it's not so good is in setting boundaries. And that's the other big issue. So or policy approach you could take. You could change taxes, for example. I mean, Austria has now a carbon tax. It's at a low level, but still it has started to go in this direction. But you can also set up regulations that really define boundaries for what you can consume and stuff like that. I think that is really necessary. And those kind of actions, they are a bit more flexible because you don't have to choose the technologies that you're going to support, but you just set boundaries and you'll allow local innovations and solutions and that's really important in a country like Austria, which is very diverse. Like more than 99% of businesses, and that's normal in Europe, or small and medium enterprises, and they were super diverse. So it's from the hairdresser, to the local store around the corner. And to address all those different businesses, you cannot design a policy for each. You need a broad boundary that gives a bit of space for all those actors to develop their own solutions that are sort of in line with the bigger targets. And that's what I'm looking at these days. It's how can we address this huge diversity and heterogeneity of the economy. So like the diversity of households and the diversity of businesses, but also cities. And so we need, I would say, a transformation that is really broad-based, so not focused only on diffusion of big technologies, as if every single actor would implement them, but have a complementary strategy that is broad-based, so that learns from what people are doing, at different sites, different locations, and then also make sure that the future is diverse. That's what I mean. We cannot just have a top-down diffusion climate policy where in the end we rank every person according to climate performance in every business and stuff like that. So that's a bit of the danger in having a purely scientific approach to it. I mean, I'm a researcher as well, but we shouldn't forget that objectifying stuff has implications for social relations as well in the end. So that's what an important sort of plea from my side would be to think also about strategies and futures that are diverse. So that's I'm going to finish with this statement and look forward to the discussion then.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Harald.
Thanks.
Jasmin?
Yes, hello, my name is Jasmin. I work at Greenpeace in Central and Eastern Europe, and I'm based in Austria and Vienna, and I'm a climate and energy campaigner. So I don't think it comes as a surprise to you that the Ukraine war is really a game changer also when it comes on the energy landscape in Europe. We already heard that from Sam before. It's just very different because before that, the toxic dependency on oil and gas from a European perspective was damaging for the climate, of course, but it wasn't really damaging or harming to the energy supply within Europe. And that really changed. And the prices are going up, and a lot of businesses and also countries have now to figure out how they actually can ditch fossil gas and oil from Russia. I think that's for sure. The question is still open, can we ditch oil and gas at all, not only from Russia? And there is the threat that we are going kind of backwards, as Sam pointed out in the beginning as well, that we get back to go fracking. This is also something that is now actually demanded by a few parties in Austria, that we look into what we can frack out of the Austrian soil on oil and gas. We see that there's a lot of LNG terminals built. We see that there's a lot of contract negotiations with countries that have very low standards on human rights issues. But we've heard a lot of negativity, and I just also wanted to point out like the positive sides and movement that we are seeing. Because the price is very high for a lot of people, it's now actually more incentivized to actually get into renewables. So people who do possess their own homes are really thinking about changing their heating, are getting their solar panels up on the roofs. So you can see really a positive movement there, because it suddenly makes also very much sense from an economical point of view. And you can also see that in companies. So I've talked to a few companies and also sustainability managers within companies, maybe also bad companies, so to say, or fossil companies, that said they had a lot of like ideas how to do energy efficiency, but they all had the ideas in the drawer because they didn't really make sense from an economical point of view. But suddenly, like, they have loads and loads of work to do, because suddenly everyone's running into the department asking how they can do now energy efficiency. A lot of corporates, which is always having this really cheap fossil gas from Russia, which and energy prices were only, or energy was only like 1% of the cost structure, so it never really made sense to invest in efficiency, and that's just really changed. I mean, we all would hope that people would, or corporates and people would change because of the climate reasons, but in fact, the price is just a very strong signal. And this was also why the environmental and climate movement is actually trying to get a CO2 price for decades now, because we know if the prices are high, the corporations and also the people will change their behavior accordingly. So it's really the question, are we going into a good or bad direction due to this shortages of oil and gas that we're seeing in Europe? But I also want to bring this into a bigger picture with COP27, because there is also the real threat that because of the energy crisis, Europe starts to look a lot more inwards and forgets about the rest of the world. So we already seen this during Corona, that the countries are focusing much more on their own securities and how to get their voters happy, and do not so much care about global cooperation. And this will be, I think, also very much a backdrop on what is going on at COP27, because we see now that a lot of European countries trying to reinvest into fossil infrastructure, which will lead a lot of other countries outside of Europe asking the question on how should we actually ditch fossil fuels if you don't even try to get rid of them. And also it means that Europe is now, there's a real threat that they are cutting down as well on climate finance. So looking at Austria is like a really bad example when it comes to climate finance. You could even see that there's actually, that they cut back on climate finance after Corona. So we had 2019 with 346 million invested in climate finance, and then it was only 260 million, so like a quarter less in 2020 due to COVID as well. And this is already from like a very, very, low position actually, when we compare what Germany, for example, invests into climate finance. So this is really a problem, and I hope that we could get it in sort of like a more positive, spiraling up, that countries are actually pushing themselves higher on climate finance, and we'll also understand that we can only face the climate crisis together as a global network, and living up actually, so Europe needs to actually live up to its responsibilities and also to the promises, because as we've heard, we already promised a few years ago that we would actually keep up with climate finance, but the 100 billions haven't been yet met. And this is just a huge issue. So closing, I would say we really need to actually make climate justice come true. Europe really needs also to look outwards its boundaries and not only think about how can we help our own citizens and our own voters, so to say, but also how can we actually help as a global community to tackle climate crisis. And the last number is just because we for example, in Austria, invest now 30 billion euros in the next years just to get rid of like the high energy prices and with the consequences of it. But we really don't even have a goal on how much we will invest in climate finance, and one of the very few countries who doesn't have a goal on where climate finance is heading until 2025. So there's a lot of homework to do, and I really do hope the government takes it seriously, so that we can all hope for the best outcome at COP27 and not a negative vibe on the negotiations, because climate finance has been actually ditched because of energy crisis and really inward-looking Europe. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Some positives and definitely some negatives there as well, some challenges. So thank you. So the questions I'd like to ask so the first one is really give us a bit of a sense of a feeling of how Austria is being impacted. So, you know, some of us have probably read about that, you know, the average increase actually in Austria seems to be almost twice the global average, for instance. You know, are people concerned about it? Is it widespread, the challenge? They might not necessarily be doing anything, we've heard that, but are they concerned about it? So I think the first thing is really just give us a sense of how it's being felt on the ground in Austria. The second is then and we've touched on a couple, but let's sort of drill into any good examples of positive things being done. And, you know, Harald, for instance, you mentioned the carbon price, for instance, but, you know, whatever it is, let's have a couple of examples there to give us all that sort of hope. And then let's move to thinking about the scaling of those things at an appropriate level of scaling. And then we'll end up with a favorite question, which is just the single most important thing to actually get moving and get this, you know, fundamentally change the speed, the depth, the breadth of the transition that we're looking for. So just, can we go to that first one then? So give us a sense of, you know, where is it in terms of people's psyche? Are they concerned about it? Are they talking about it? Are they ignoring it? Is it a young people thing? Are people understanding or attributing, you know, extreme weather events to climate change? So just give us a bit of a sense of that, please. Who wants to start of the three of you? Jasmin, hand up.
Yeah, I think people do take the climate crisis to a certain extent seriously. I don't think we have a lot of problems with climate deniers, so to say, in Austria. Obviously, there will always be people who deny the climate crisis, but I don't think it's a significant portion of the public. But I think the real battle is when it comes to how to fight the climate crisis. So you can always say, yeah, I'm for like climate protection. And when it comes down to, okay, but what are we actually then going to do? Are we going to build windmills and they're going to be in the location of your home? You get a lot of, resistance. When it comes down to actually rebuilding the mobility system, you get a lot of resistance. So I think it's really when it comes to really concrete measures, that's when it's actually starting to get a lot more harder to actually implement climate measures. And that is also, I think, a problem about how the climate discourse has also been framed in the last years, also by politicians. So it was a lot of more like, waste management and, don't take plastic bottles with you, and a lot of like this individual consumer choices, and that the focus was on, but not really building up a system that actually helps you to do climate friendly action. So it was just fossil subsidies is still a big thing in Austria as well, and you get a lot of subsidies for buying cars and stuff. So there's been put a lot of money into the negative and climate damaging actions rather than the climate friendly actions. So yeah, I think that's kind of where the public is at. So they are pro climate action, but not when it comes down to the single measures.
Okay. And David, your role as an activist, what have you felt?
I would completely agree with what Jasmin has just said, and also add to that even people who usually wouldn't worry that much about the climate crisis, who wouldn't get active to protest for climate justice, are now starting to think about these topics, because suddenly they get the new energy bill and it's twice as high as it was a year ago. And then people start to think, well, why is that the case? And what can I do personally to maybe become more independent of fossil fuels and of other things that have driven these prices? And so suddenly we see that not really by the path of climate justice or of climate protection, but actually to the path of how our energy system is built, and how it's still very much built on fossil fuels and on this dependency on nations like Russia, which at the beginning of this year still made up around 80% of our gas imports. Now suddenly we're starting to think, and a lot of people are starting to think, well, why did we get ourselves into this situation, into this sort of dependency on these nations, on these fossil fuels, and what can we do to become more independent and to become more resilient? And of course, renewable energies are one way of going about that. And very much like Jasmin has said, I think in theory, now everyone is for renewable energies, which is a huge step forward compared to a few years ago. But in practice, that looks very different, because then obviously you get questions like, well, what infrastructure do we need for that? Where are we actually building these 9 wind power plants that we need to build every single month to actually reach the goal that we set ourselves, which is to become 100% renewable in our electricity production by 2030, which is very, very soon. So this has very real practical implications that we can see on the landscapes around us and so on. And that's when people start pushing back and be like, well, of course we want to protect the climate, of course we want to become independent of Russia, but please, not in my backyard. And that's exactly the challenge that we're up against, I think, a lot of the time. But in general, I think there has been also, partly driven by movements like Fridays for Future, a huge shift from not talking about the climate crisis at all to now talking about the climate crisis, but with a sort of note attached to that, which is, now when we talk about the climate crisis, we often talk about climate protection in very superficial ways. So you get every company now putting up posters on how sustainable they are. You get all of these sustainability reports by companies like the OMV, which is a huge fossil company in Austria, which is responsible for a huge chunk of Austria's emissions. And you start to question, well, are we actually wanting to protect the climate, or are we just wanting to claim we are protecting the climate for sort of marketing and greenwashing reasons? And so I think we need to be very careful there to also not take, oh, everyone is talking about the climate as a good sign, when we actually need to question, well, what's actually happening? And like Harald has said before, Austria is one of the few states, one of, I think, only 3 or 4 in the European Union, which hasn't reduced its emissions in the last 30 years. Nearly no state has done it to an extent that would be aligned with the Paris Agreement, but most other states, if you look to Germany, for example, have reduced their emissions in the last decades. Austria hasn't. And so I think we really need to pay attention to action and to actual emissions, and not so much to words when it comes to that.
And David, just so drilling into this sort of, so people get it, which is great, and it's a high standard of education, so they're understanding it. That's much better than obviously ignorance or denial, definitely. I guess how has it felt though? Because I would imagine, obviously you've got the Alps, you've got urban heat sinks that we read about. So are people worried? Are they worried on their own behalf, or is it more a sort of this global challenge that we all face, and they're intellectually understanding it, and therefore when it comes to implementation, they're sort of not quite sure? So are people feeling it? Are they concerned?
I mean, I think always, before we talk about climate impacts in Austria, we need to say that the real impacts of this crisis, the sort of life-threatening impacts, are felt in other places. And that is obviously the huge global injustice about this crisis, is we are the ones causing this crisis, and we are not the ones that are feeling it the strongest. Still, having said that, we feel this crisis everywhere you look in Austria, and there's really no denying. I mean, you can go to our glaciers, and by the time that I'm 60 or 70, most of Austria's glaciers will have disappeared. Some have already reached tipping points where it will be impossible to recover them, even if we would be able to stop warming now. Austria, as a country, has already warmed up by close to 2 degrees in the last 100 years. And obviously that has impacts not just on glaciers, but also on skiing, which is sort of still part of national pride here in Austria. And obviously it's also something that many people associate with the state of Austria. It's hugely impactful on things like tourism. Recently, I went to Tichsee, which is a lake, or I should say was a lake in Burgenland, very close to Vienna, which is a completely absurd place, because you can stand literally in the lake, it looks like a desert. And when you look around, you still see showers and changing cabins, and it would sort of be this thing where people would go to cool off and to go for a swim. And now you simply can't, because temperatures that that we have in summer, and we do get quite extreme heat waves, which also cause, you know, hundreds of heat deaths every year, of additional deaths caused by heat, simply make it impossible more. And of course, what we also see is often when we talk about the climate crisis, we talk about emissions. But of course, what we don't talk about that often, but what is equally as important, is we are in the 6th great mass extinction. The first one experienced by modern humans, and also the first one caused mainly by modern humans. And we can see that on a global level, but also in Austria. So whether you look at bird life or insects or go into the forest, you can see the diversity of wildlife slowly diminishing. And of course, you can say, well, 1 species or 2 species, that doesn't make a huge difference. That happens all the time. But with 100 species plus every day that disappear worldwide, that has impacts on the species that are dependent on these species, has impacts on whole ecosystems, and obviously ultimately has impacts on us human beings. And so, you know, wherever you look in Austria, you can definitely feel the impacts, and they will only be felt much more strong in the next few years. At the same time, I think, just to round this off, I think we can't afford to wait until this crisis becomes sort of life-threatening for everyday Austrians. I mean, we need to act, not just because of us feeling this crisis, but because we have a global responsibility for this crisis that we've caused, and we need to make sure that people in the global south are not literally dying because of this crisis that we are mainly responsible for.
No, well stated. And Harald, sort of, I guess the same question, but really hopefully from a business perspective. You know, again, you know, David's mentioned and raised the point about greenwashing. I think you've already said that, you know, people are thinking about efficiency quite a lot, which is good. But again, are they feeling this sharply? And, you know, and where does that sort of feeling or motivation come from? Is it all about efficiency and saving costs and money? Is it because they're seeing significant impacts themselves of climate change, or is it because it's a more, you know, global understanding of what's happening and what's down the road?
I think we need to differentiate a little bit what kind of businesses we're talking about. When we look at all the businesses that are founded each year, I mean, tens of thousands of businesses in Austria. More than 2/3 of them are green businesses, actually, so they're quite ambitious. But when you look at established businesses, it's a bit tricky. So the main focus there is on energy efficiency, as I said before, and waste management. So Austria is traditionally strong in recycling. That's something also businesses do. But Austria is also, you know, internationally speaking, it's also a leader in the provision of green products, broadly speaking. But even so, we're talking about like 20% of businesses that provide such products. That means 80% have no green products at all. So we always need to look at the reverse. So it's a bit tricky, and I think that at the moment the main issues are supply chain, and so many businesses feel it in their supply chain, and it's resource scarcity as well. That's one of the main issues, and obviously prices now. Those are the 2 big issues, I'd say. But just to add a bit of nuance to what has been said before, I think that in Austria awareness is extremely high for climate, in my view. I mean, there's a bit of a counter argument that is quite powerful, I'd say, and there's always this kind of struggle to explain to Austrians why it's important to do something, given that Austria is so small. You know, there's a constant argument that, you know, China is the big emitter today, or Austria cannot do anything. I think that's extremely important that we, I mean, as David said before, that, you know, you just have to justify kind of why Austria has to do anything. But that's something, you know, this argument comes from a specific political angle. I don't think it's dominant at all. Climate awareness is extremely high overall. And I think there has been like as a positive example, I would say, there has been a sort of a climate council, and has been set up, I think more than a year ago, but it was a process of consisting of around 100 citizens, a very, very mixed group of people, you know, from across society, basically. And they have had several rounds of discussion where they defined climate targets and climate actions, and they were really ambitious, even though, you know, this was not a selected group of people. They were supposed to be representative, and I think that was achieved, and which shows again that, you know, with some deliberation, I think people are in favor of ambitious policies, and I think that's the one big thing that I would add to what was said before. It is true that on an individual level, there is not a huge willingness to act, but there's a very, very strong support, I would say, for collective action and policy making. And so just to give you one example, there was this carbon tax. It came at a worst possible time. 2 weeks ago or 1 week ago, the prices went up for gasoline by 8 cents or something. It's really bad timing for a carbon tax. But even so, there's no public backlash. It's not a big topic, so it's widely accepted, even the public, even though it's a really bad timing. And there's broad support for, you know, even for such a measure in this time. So I'd say we should, and that's a general issue that I face all the time when I talk to people, you know, in policy administrations and researchers. It's a constant assumption that they are themselves doing much more than others. And you constantly have to sort of almost predict what others will do. And a lot of times you start very ambitiously and they are already, make it less ambitious before they even tried it, only in expectation that others wouldn't accept it. And that's I think something I constantly observe. I think we should try more and just see what happens, and you would see that a lot of times it is accepted. It's fine. There are other people that are very ambitious as well, and it's really about setting collective boundaries for ourselves and you know, collective infrastructures and stuff like that. So I don't think we need to act on an individual level as much as just, you know, showcasing our support for ambitious actions that are collective. I think that's a very different take. I think on, you know, you don't have to rely on individual willingness to act, which is really difficult in a world that defines how we go about our everyday lives.
Well, that's encouraging, but it does mean that people have to express their acceptance of those things. Because I think what's happened in the UK
That's right, yeah.
is we've suddenly got this sharp polarization where, you know, the new Prime Minister is saying, you know, growth is, you know, they can't literally, somebody said we can't afford to implement, you know, whatever the policies were around sort of the transition this year. We can't afford it. You know, so there's a sort of polarization. You can either have economic growth or you've got to think about, you know, the green transition. And, you know, we all know that that's a false dichotomy, but unfortunately that's been put forward. So I think it's fantastic if there's collective appetite to have collective solutions. That's great. But, you know, I would just ask, you know, all Austrians to make sure that the politicians know there is that collective appetite. And so it doesn't become, you know, politically polarized as it is in the UK.
But there's no mechanism for that. That's the problem. We have the media, but which is about polarizing a lot of times. But what sociologists show is that there's a lot of consensus and on all those kind of measures, and that's a big problem. But if there's, you know, 10% of a very loud group, it will gain a lot of attention, because even in the media, you know, every panel somehow has to consist of different opinions, even though it's not representative, you know, at all. I think that's a really big issue, and we lack those kind of mechanisms that show how much support there is for such actions. That is an issue. I think it's an issue for democracy at large.
David.
But Harald, I think you just mentioned one of the mechanisms that you know, might actually work in this case, which is this Bürgerinnenrat, this sort of coalition of citizens, where 80 random citizens from around Austria came together for a couple of weekends and sort of worked on what they would like the government to do in the age of a climate crisis. And this shows exactly what you just said. You know, there is a huge, once people learn the science, and this is a huge one, like at the beginning they had workshops with scientists on glacier scientists on sort of wildlife diversity and so on. And once they learned all of these facts, they had some much more radical ideas than many in the Green Party in Austria even had. But of course, there is no mechanism, as you say, to then take these results from the Citizens' Assembly and actually transfer it into actual legislation. And I think this is an important missing link. So I think in many ways, we've even found some ways of representing citizens' voices, but we need to be better, or politics needs to get better at actually putting these things into action, I think.
Mm. Yeah, and there's been mixed success around those climate assemblies. We've had them in the UK, we've had them at local level as well. Obviously, they've had them in France. I think they've had 2 or 3 in France. So, but potentially a really powerful mechanism. So, okay, so Jasmin, do you want to sort of point to any solution that you've seen, or particular action, tactic, mechanism, anything that gives you'd like to point out that we should do more of, something that's having a positive impact?
Yeah, I think everything that we point out as good solutions is obviously never enough. So that being said, as a disclaimer before, but I think like we had the Green Conservative Party, and sometimes we have to also point out what they did right. And I think as a good example, I would like to draw the attention to the climate ticket, so to say. So it's a Klimaticket in Austria. And for like 1,000 years, you can ride every public transport in the whole country. And I think that was really a measure that was not really easy to implement, because you had to bring together a lot of different companies to actually agree on. And a lot of people before in the area said that is never actually going to happen, and it did. And I think that's really a cool measure, and can be also a blueprint to a lot of other countries to make public transport not only rather cheap, because if you are commuting or if you are going a lot by train, it makes it a lot more cheaper for you, but also in terms of accessibility, because for example, I use the climate ticket, and I'm not even sure if it's so much cheaper for me to actually use it, but just the idea of not thinking about buying a train ticket and just be like, in whichever city I am entering in Austria, I can just hop onto the bus and don't even need to think about where to get a ticket. It's just something that's really, also changing in your mind how you're using transportation. And I think that's a good example of how you can actually, what I said before, like how you can actually change, the system in a way that makes climate-friendly mobility, in that case, much cheaper, also easy to access, and therefore you will use it, not because you're, I don't know, Greta Thunberg, but because it's just the more economic choice for you as well. And I think this has to be like the blueprint for every measure that we do. Because we can't really hope that people will do a lot of things because of their good conscience or because of their moral high ground, but just because it's easy for them and it's cheap for them. And then there will be automatically a shift to climate-friendly measures and activities.
Excellent. Okay, great example. Wish we had that here. So just to wrap up then. So, and it might be that you choose some of the things you've talked about, but that just what is that single thing, that single push, that single whatever it might be mechanism that you would ask for if you had the choice, you would ask for now to be rolled out in Austria, which would fundamentally change the speed, the depth, the breadth, and the transition. And it's very interesting as we have these sessions and ask this question in the different countries, because the answers do differ by country significantly. And I bet I'll tell you what the French one was after you've told me, but I bet you're not going to come up with that one. But anyway, so why don't we get David, Jasmin, Harald, and then we'll move to the other three.
Well, at the risk of repeating myself, I think I'd start with what I started with today, which is the climate protection law, because ultimately we can talk about individual measures, and all of these are really important, and some of them really groundbreaking, like the like this public transport ticket we've got. But I think for all of us to be able to sort of imagine this pathway to 2040 where Austria wants to be net zero, we need a more detailed plan, and especially industry and businesses are asking for politicians to tell them what will be possible to do at certain, at certain waymarks to 2040. I mean, we won't be able to just at 2039 just cut off and just say, well, that's it, over and out, no more emissions left. In fact, that we would reach that point much sooner if we just kept going like we do today. But in fact, what we need is a sort of plan for this massive transformation that awaits us. I mean, no one really knows how Austria is going to look like in 2040 if we actually want to meet this goal. And so I think we need this sort of framework where all of these individual measures can be measured against one another by effectiveness, but also can be measured against the science. And the science says very clearly that we must not pass 1.5 degrees, and every tenth of a degree counts and makes a huge, huge difference in terms of tipping points and so on. And so what I would probably, if I could sort of, have my magic wand out, my magic climate policy wand, I think I'd use it for the climate protection law and make sure that that there's not just goals, but also a concrete plan what happens if certain goals aren't met. I think that would be incredibly important. And if that's too huge of an ask, if we could just get sort of climate protection at the constitutional level, we could at least call on the courts to sort of, have a look and sort of have a function to check on our politicians whether they're actually acting according to the science or not.
Very good. I can't make that happen, unfortunately, David, but I very much hope it does. Harald?
Yeah, I think I would agree to put it in brief, but be a bit more specific probably, because I mean it would be, you have to specify still what kind of law it would be. But I think for my single biggest measure would be just pragmatic, to be honest, and to be really quick and accelerate the transition, and that would be a more ambitious eco-social tax reform. So that such a reform has been set up in Austria. I think it was 1 year ago, 2 years ago. I don't know. Yeah, it's so this carbon tax is part of it, but there's plenty of space to make it much more ambitious. I think that would be really powerful and be really important to as a way to align climate policy and climate action with social inclusion. I think that's a very, very important issue. We shouldn't forget. So I wouldn't trust in regulation alone. I don't know if policymakers care how policymakers in 10 years will be affected by any kind of commitments that are made today. I would probably prefer an immediate reform of taxes.
Very good. Jasmin, last word.
Yeah, I think Harald stole mine. But I would say ditch fossil fuels. So like stop doing the wrong thing, subsidize climate-friendly choices. And that all comes along with actually giving climate damaging actions just a real price, and have a real price that really includes the climate damage being done by the use of fossil fuels.
Okay, brilliant. So in France, across a very broad range of different types of people, they went for education, which was super. I mean, anyway,
it will take time.
Well, exactly. Well, but it does. But also, somebody made the point: it's not education of kids, which would take sort of almost even longer until it's actually the education of the electorate and the business people and the older voters and blah blah blah. But very interesting that almost that whether it was business or environmental NGO or whatever, they all came around to it. Anyway, thank you so much. Yeah, please stay online. Do ask questions of the others if you want to. But now, if we can do in alphabetical order, so if we can go Laszlo, then Marvin, and then Pauline. Let's hear from you guys.
Yeah, hello, my name is Laszlo Lepp. I'll give you a short introduction of myself. I'm a senior scientist at the Passive House Institute in Innsbruck, and also part of the scientific advisory board of the Austrian Passive House network called Passive House Austria. We are working on energy efficiency in buildings. So if I talk about challenges and solutions or whatever, I will focus on the building sector. So that this is where we have expertise. Why are buildings so important? Well, because this sector is responsible for about 36% of the final energy consumption and 37% of direct and indirect CO2 emissions. So these are numbers from the global status report of the GABC, which is the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction. And if you are somehow confused about these numbers, because we have in Austria also annual reports by the Umweltbundesamt, which is the federal environment agency, with around 10 or 12% emissions for the building sector. But this is because a major part of the emissions is in other sectors like the district heating and electricity, for example. So be careful to read and how to interpret these studies. To make it clear, I think the building sector is, if I remember correctly, the only one sector which have a decreasing CO2 emission in the last years. And this is because why is that? Because in every change from oil and gas boiler to district heating or a heat pump is just shifted into another sector. So that makes the building sector better and better without doing anything on the building envelope or whatever. So we need as much energy as before, but the emissions are just shifted into another one, to industry and energy sector. So just be careful of this number. And this also means that the 37% of CO2 emissions is the major part. So the buildings emit more carbon emissions than the other sectors, like mobility or whatever. And this sector is also a very inert sector because the life cycles are the highest. So in the change in the cars going to electric cars, we can handle this within the next 10 or 12 years. But the building sector has completely different life cycles, like 50, 60, or even 100 years. So if we want to achieve changes in that sector, so lower energy demand and lower emissions, we have to use and implement the best available solutions. And this is exactly what we have with the Passive House standard, and this for 30 years now. So the first Passive House was built 1991. These buildings, these passive houses, consume up to 90% less energy than existing buildings with a conventional standard. And also nowadays, even a factor 3 to 5 less than the new built one. The major problem, or well, let's say challenge, is that our national regulations for buildings are not suitable with the scientific knowledge, or not on the same level as the scientific findings, as we heard before as well. So we have a huge difference between the subsidies and between the broad mass of the buildings built by the national regulation. So we need a stronger political commitment to increase serious attempts to slow down this climate change, and without consideration of other lobby groups with contrary opinions and great influence on governments. Well, without mentioning any sector here, but our approach is just to push for the most efficient and most economical building standard, which is the passive house over the life cycle, and to demonstrate the success of realized passive houses through measurements, and to publish the scientific findings widely and make knowledge available. And this in Austria and all around the globe. Passive house is possible for all uses. We have not only residential buildings, but offices, schools, kindergartens, hotels, supermarkets, swimming pools, museums, whatever, and many more. This is but because this standard is completely independent, politically independent, and based on physics. So it works everywhere, all around the globe. of course, under different boundary conditions. So a passive house in the Arctic will look like different from the passive house in the desert, of course, but the principle is the same. And yeah, we have a high density of passive houses in Austria due to the historical development, of course. So many Austrian pioneers were involved in the development and distribution in Austria. But we have also, yeah, great resistance from many sides and some wrong definitions of the standard, and yeah, buildings which were called passive houses, which are definitely not passive houses and cause problems and whatever. So we have we still have to invest a lot of time in setting the wrong claims straight. And I don't want to give you examples, so as not to repeat these misconceptions. But yeah, looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Laszlo. Marvin.
Hey everyone. Also, let me start off by saying a huge thank you to the panelists before. They have covered so much of the things I wanted to talk about, so I can go into different realms now. So my name is Marvin. I'm a UN Youth Delegate of Austria at the moment, one of two, which means I have the pleasure to represent a lot of young, motivated Austrians in front of the United Nations organizations. As you know, the COP, there are multiple different COPs when it comes to different UN organizations. So whilst I have the pleasure to, for example, work with UNODC a lot, obviously the number one thing that youth is really talking about and it's impacting their lives really a lot is definitely the climate crisis. And because there has been a lot of conversation about education and a lot of conversation about goals, one of the central pillars of my work are the Sustainable Development Goals. You probably all know them. There are goals which are set till 2030, 17 goals, which should include not only the economical, but also the ecological and social aspect of different realms. And what I'm seeing in my work right now, and which is a very positive development, is that when it comes to private or public partnerships, or also when it comes to public just projects and planning for the future, more and more focus is actually laid on the SDGs and methodologies which are making sure that all of these three pillars are working with another and not one instead of the others. So this is really interesting to note, in my opinion, and it's a great development to see. In my work, I'm also having the huge pleasure to work with the Austrian National Youth Council. It is by law the representation of everyone under 30 in Austria, and in this regard, they have been doing some very nice events. For example, we've been talking about the Civil Council, the Austrian Civil Council, when it comes to the environmental change. But there's also the Civil Youth Council, which was coordinated by the Austrian National Youth Council. And it actually had some very, very interesting, in my opinion, outcomes. And because we have been talking about education, around 70% of the asked people in this council actually felt that youth is accordingly and enough informed about the climate crisis, whilst 75% think that their personal needs and what they're standing for is unfortunately not represented in politics at the moment. And even more so, 80%, and 80%, I mean, no matter in which bubble you are, if 80% say something, it's a shocking number, say that their ideas, their visions and their projects and the projects that people who are in public office are promising are not kept, and they have unfortunately no idea on how they could change this. So to combine all of these things that I have just now said, my focus is really on making sure that youth voices are heard in this whole discussion. And I mean, I can only say a huge thank you in this part for Fridays for Future and everyone else who is, especially in the climate debate, and realizing that youth is a central pillar of the future and the present. And that youth is slowly having their foot in the door to climate we can see, I mean, Pauline is probably going to talk about it with the UNFCCC delegates, and there are delegates in this regard, whilst another topics unfortunately still don't get that kind of spotlight. And however, here, even though the foot has been placed in the door, there is still a problem with real substantial inclusion of youth. Lastly, I wanted to also say that obviously this panel is on the climate crisis, and the COP is focusing in this regard. But if you look at the planetary boundaries, and I think David has been spotlighting upon it, we're also in a huge biodiversity crisis right now. We can see a huge shocking numbers when it comes to loss of biodiversity, when it comes to a loss of genetic material. So the extinction wave is just coming through, and we can also see that there is a biogeochemical. We're facing our borders there in this regard. So when it comes to phosphorus or nitrous, nitrate circles, we're also on the edge of destroying these. So a lot to do, and looking forward to the further questions, and hopefully you could take some things out of this future way.
Thank you, Marvin. Morning.
This and generally the Walk2COP27 team, and thanks everyone else for already like great contributions. And as Marvin said, many of the things that Austria does / does not do has been mentioned already. But maybe let me introduce myself first, and then maybe I can add one or two things. So I'm Pauline Trepczyk. I have co-founded Climate Austria, which is a youth-led climate organization in 2018. So our aim is to raise the youth voice in the climate area. So we are working with the Austrian federal ministries. We are also organizing local conference of youth. And as Marvin said, we are sending youth delegates to the UN climate change conferences. And so basically we focus on what youth want in Austria, and bringing it to the global perspective, working with other young people, especially also from the global south, to increase their voice and remind the Austrian government what actually is going on. So they're not blinded by the technicalities of the negotiations, but also reminding them of what's really out there, quite literally outside those four walls. Two things I wanted to mention, and I wanted to quote Greta's piece in The Guardian that was published yesterday, where she again highlighted that the Paris Agreement is just the bare minimum that countries agreed on. It's a common denominator, but it's actually quite weak in itself regarding the climate crisis. It's non-binding. 1.5 degrees Celsius already has horrid effects to the whole planet, and still it is voluntary. So if countries try to work within the gray zone, or still try to cheat within this contract, it's still just devastating, because they're cheating an already very weak contract. So just this as a reminder that we cannot forget that although we always quote the Paris Agreement, and it's great that everyone agreed on it, it is just sad that we even try to make a way out of this already. Those goals or targets that already have horrible impacts to millions of people. And the second thing I wanted to say is, and I had this conversation actually at COP26 with a colleague, and we were discussing that mostly environment / energy ministers are coming there representing governments, and only sometimes heads of governments or states are coming. But I mean, I guess all of you know, but the crisis is not simply a climate ministry topic. It concerns so many more industries and ministries, and climate change is a threat multiplier for humanitarian crises as well. So governments have to work across ministries and not only shove everything towards the climate or energy ministry to solve this. We need to act on this together. So I think it would be wonderful if next COPs would actually see heads of government or heads of state there, and not only climate and energy ministers, especially because some of the ministries are separating all of those topics. some countries have a fossil fuel and energy ministry, some separate economy as well. So it's just hard if you send the environmental person to a UN climate change conference for them to tell their colleagues, look, you have to do this. And as we know, ministers don't like to be told what they need to do. So I think there's also a core problem of this whole process. In general, I think it's very important to have this moment. We see that media is reporting more on climate change if a COP is happening. But we, I guess, also as a civil society need to use this momentum to then go home and say to our heads of government, to our government in general, look, you need to do your homework. This is just a great hook to talk to your host country or to your country, but the UN Climate Change Conference won't solve this. It's actually countries that need to implement stronger policies at home to make more progress. Thank you.
No, thank you. And for apologies that you went last, because you did a great job by not duplicating everything that was said before. Your point about your Greta's point about, the Paris Agreement, yeah, it's very well made. And my understanding is there's a similar thing going on with the IPCC reports, which is effectively written, to a level of consensus, which then has to get signed off by the clients, which is effectively a whole bunch of governments. So if I'm wrong, then call me out, anybody. But that's the same way. So look at it; it's absolutely horrific, and yet, I'm sure it would have been a lot worse if it hadn't gone through, endless revisions and reviews to make sure that it is in some way acceptable to effectively the client governments. So, and when we remind ourselves of that, yes, it is. Yeah, it is a little bit scary. The point about systems, I think, is really well made as well. So, Marvin, you were saying you were pleased actually to see, the three elements, I guess, of environmental, social, and economic sort of coming together, and there's more sort of system thinking about when people get challenged on certain things. I mean, you didn't say system thinking, maybe I'm misthinking, but at the same time, sort of, I guess, Pauline, you're sort of pointing out that perhaps that's still lacking, and obviously it's not binary, but it is a critically important thing. And some of the other conversations in the other town halls have spent quite a lot of time talking about systems change. And one concern I think that everybody's got is a complexity. Are we actually sophisticated enough? Do we have the mechanisms, for instance, in government? Do we have the, do we have the science to actually really create system solutions? Even defining the system, a particular system is difficult once you're given a problem. So that has come up a fair amount in the past. It's obviously a wide-reaching, multifaceted issue and challenge that we're talking about, but it's also, the more dimensions you layer on, obviously, the more difficult it is to address it. So would any of the three of you want to add on anything to that first question where we talked about, is this something sort of felt viscerally? Is it an intellectual thing that people feel? Is it because of the costs largely, and that's sort of allowing a better understanding? Do you want to add anything to that, or do you think we've sort of pretty much summarized that already? Cool.
Hi, I think what everyone on the panel said is already covering the Austrian mentality about this, but what I wanted to add is, yes, we don't have climate deniers, but I guess loads and loads of climate people that use delay tactics. So there's also been a great scientific paper that lists 12 tactics that people use to delay climate policies. It is, for example, oh, this carbon tax is not socially inclusive enough. We can't sign this off yet because it's not including this tiny detail, or saying Austria is too tiny of a country to make a difference in the world. They're actually bigger emitters that need to do something. So I think just acknowledging the fact that although people realize there's a climate crisis, they often use just excuses to delay progress. So, and with that in mind, when I try to talk to people and they say, oh no, I actually can't do this because of blah, blah, then I have those 12, the list of 12 things in my head and try to catch breath. Oh, you're delayed. Okay, how can I, maybe convince the person that this policy might be good enough, because climate crisis itself is horrible enough.
Yeah, well stated. Laszlo?
Well, what I can tell you is that we do have a role model function in Europe in general, but also in Austria. It doesn't depend on the country, how small or big the country is, but I can remember it was maybe, I mean, I'm at the Passive House Institute since 2010 now, and I think it was 2012 or 2013 that I had a huge group of Chinese people here in Innsbruck, just having an excursion and visit realized passive houses, and the people were from the building and construction ministry from Beijing. So and they told us, please help us. We have huge health problems. We have huge air pollution and whatever, and we need solutions. Yeah, and this is why I think that it's really important how we act and what we implement and what we do, because all the Chinese people or India or whatever other countries and continents, they just have a look what happens in Europe or in America as well, maybe in the US, but this is why it was important just to push forward this development in Austria and Germany and Europe, this passive house development, because now we have really huge size projects in China. They build passive houses to avoid air pollution. Yeah? So this is a positive example. Of course, it's not everything okay and correct what they do, but if they build passive, if they build buildings, they don't build one building. They build 10,000 units of them. And at the first stage, they told us, well, let's make one small passive house in this settlement. And now all the settlement is a very efficient passive house standard. So I think it's very important. So it was really good to learn that it's really important how we act here in a small country.
Yeah, and that's great, because that talks to opportunity, to upside. It's something you get political will behind. There's economic benefits, so it sort of unites pretty much everything, that sort of example. So that's interesting. Marvin.
It's actually one of the facts, I think, which makes me more hopeful about our future, that China has realized that air pollution is causing them so much trouble, and that in the future no one will invest into countries which will not uphold their climate goals. That they're actually driving towards change. Obviously, we're then not only talking about the ecological but social aspects or human rights aspects, but in this regard. What I wanted to say and outline a bit, and I think it has already been said in the panel, but I think it's something to really highlight again. Obviously, we're looking all of these things through a very privileged point of view. It was also said that, of course, there are heat deaths in Austria. And in Europe, I think this summer there were more heat deaths than COVID deaths, but it's still a thing where we are. I mean, we're living in a time of the huge forest fires and seeing them all around in Portugal and Spain, but we are still living in our day-to-day view, and I think not looking through the glasses of also a bit of social exclusion. And I think what is very important in this discussion is also this point of leaving no one behind, which is obviously at the center of almost all climate efforts. And looking at Austria, where we have 8.7 million inhabitants, we have 1.5 million people who are on the edge of exclusion or poverty. So these are people who also need a different step towards where they're also using a lot of energy, obviously, because they have not the newest technology to spend. So for the money they're earning, they're actually using a lot of energy. So to make sure that a just transition in this regard, also in a regard where it goes, especially in concerning to the global south, or groups which have it as particularly hard, financially or for health reasons, is obviously, and youth is in this regard one of the players. So there has been UNHCR reports which highlights how heat waves will be extremely bad for 0 to 5-year-olds, obviously because they have not developed yet their heart capacity and lung capacity. So just putting it in at the center again, that leaving no one behind is obviously one of the main focuses, also in a global perspective, hopefully.
Mm. Yeah, no, very much so. So, okay, so moving on to some solutions. I mean, obviously, Laszlo, you're talking from the position of somebody who offers a solution to some part of this issue, right? So the question then moves to scaling, rather than, you know, more defining around the sort of scientific approach to passive. But how on earth do you scale it? Because I bet it's expensive. I bet it's way beyond many people's perceived ability to afford it, let alone the 1.x that Marvin's just referred to. So how do we, you know, if you have a solution like that, how do you massively scale it in the economy?
We have a very good example in Innsbruck. It was a European funded project from 2014 to 2020, which is called Symphonia. And we worked on renovations of the building stock in Innsbruck, buildings from the 1950s, 1970s, so a very huge energy demand, residential buildings in habitat state to refurbish, and also school building, which were renovated to the specified standard, which is called NFIT. And the monitoring results, there was a huge monitoring program behind, clearly show that we have energy savings of around 77% at the moment at the first step, because it was a step-by-step renovation. And after the final stage, when we have all units, all apartments connected to the ventilation system, for example, and changing all windows, we have a potential to of up to 84% less final energy consumption compared to the existing building before. And that means it was around 65,000 square meters project, so hundreds of apartments. And I think this will be our future challenge, how to renovate the building stock in Europe. One more thought about this, because it's the most of the time a political thing that they want to have to increase the renovation rate. So we need much more renovation. But what we see in our scientific studies, that we need to increase the renovation quality. So with higher efficiency, instead of only increasing the renovation rate by keeping the low national regulation standard. So this is very important, to go step-by-step refurbishments, and then to go to the highest level in each step. So this will be the best path to reduce CO2 emissions in the building sector. And another thought is that it seems that there is like a kind of competition between efficiency and renewable supply at the moment. So everyone wants to get out of gas and oil and put a heat pump in there, or connect it to the district heating, which is good. So renewable supply is really an important thing, but no one is thinking about how to reduce our consumption, how to reduce our need of energy. And this is our approach. This is the efficiency approach. Just at the first step, to reduce our consumption, our needs, and then we need only a little energy supply by the renewable systems, because otherwise we are not able to shift all the this overconsumption generation from the summertime into the winter. We have the possibility to shift from day to night using batteries or whatever, or also to pump up the water into the mountains here in Austria. But it is really a huge amount of energy that we need to shift from summer to the winter time. And we need more capacity. So this is how to scale up our approach. So in that case, I'm more like a French, education in energy efficiency and in renewables at every level, from kindergarten to the university, from craftsman to the architect and all others in between. And this is what we try to organize in our Passive House Austria network. So we have great pioneers, have been doing great work since the beginning, and we have realized projects in many cases as role models for others. And our members are highly dedicated and involved in developments and implementation. Just have a look to the national and international awards and whatever. But we need urgently for climate protection reliable professionals with know-how in energy efficiency.
Yeah. And when you get your last question, you can vote for, is it supply side or demand side, or well, how would you wave your magic wand? So
well, we need both, but we have a priority. We need a priority to prioritize.
One vote, Laszlo. Sorry, mate. Oh. So we're going to hear that answer in a minute. So Paula, just to you quickly. So I mean, obviously you set up climates with the belief that that's going to make a difference. So, and you're still involved in it. So obviously it is making a difference. So same question to you, scaling, how do you make it, transform what's happening? How does that become, a real driver of mass change more than it has been?
No.
Could you just put in, for some reason, we just missed that first bit, even though you came off.
Oh, sorry. Just a question back, like, you mean what we can do now to scale up climate action?
Yeah, no, but just particularly with thinking about climate so you're, the organization you co-founded, you've worked on that now for whatever, was it 3 years, 4 years?
4 years, yeah.
Right. So when you think about, the challenges to achieving the impact you're hoping to have, and you think about the good examples of the impact that you have had, just specifically what how would you massively scale that?
So our goal in climate generally is to empower youth, and we have different approaches. And I think if we can copy them or even optimize them, improve them in other countries, that will be wonderful. So if what we try to do is also inspire other governments to send UNFCCC youth delegates to climate change conferences, because then you have a representation of the youngest generation that will be most impacted in your country. And also kind of as a reminder, who mostly, unfortunately, all white men are deciding on, that what counts. So on the one hand, give them a space at UN climate change conferences around the world. But also what we do is have the local conference of youth. So that is the official conference of youth, always a couple of days before a COP on site in the same city. But because not every young person can travel there, there are local versions of it. And if you educate change makers on site, and then they carry that into their friends group, families, workplace, uni, wherever, if they just get access to the education, that's where we come back again. We see not only our aim to do those projects and tell those people what they can do, but also indirectly we empower those people to, unfortunately in this world of internships and the experience you need to have for an entry job nowadays, that they already have experience to get into those positions of power, get jobs in the EU, UN, or in the government, to then actually have motivated people sitting in those important seats. So yeah, I think that's our aim of climate, to kind of bring this topic out into the world, accessible for young people, digesting it from the complicated scientific reports, but also indirectly giving them the chance to have some kind of agency in the long term, so they get into positions of power.
Yeah, and I think that that idea of a position of an affiliation which is stronger than the affiliation to the organization you work for is really powerful. So, you know, historically in the UK, it's all you know, unions is an example of that. So cross-organization. I'm not an expert at how the unions are driving change in and around climate, but, you know, incredibly powerful if those people, if the youth are retaining that affiliation as then they go into business or the UN system or whatever else it is, and they've got a circle of really motivated people to, you know, to keep them true when they're getting battered by the organizational politics or whatever else they are. That's a great vision. Okay, fantastic. So same question. So Laszlo, you know, you get your chance now. So why don't we start with why don't we go Marvin, Laszlo, Pauline for you? And it can, if it's the same as that somebody else's, that's fine as well, because that's super interesting, because then we're beginning to get some sort of consensus around something. But it's the same question really. You just try and step outside your, you know, specific role, maybe in experience, to say, you know, if you got the magic wand, what do you make come alive to fundamentally change the speed, depth, breadth of the transition in Austria?
For me, it would be obviously it's SDG focused. So I've been already talking a lot about putting the people over the profit, putting social and ecological aspects very much in the center. And for me, waving my magic wand would obviously be to make sure that we have, as Harald said, a tax system which facilitates this, or just an economy which is centered in this direction. I have the pleasure to study economics, and these are all externalities which are not factored into the price. So, for example, supply chain law, which makes sure that not someone who's producing your pair of jeans only gets $4, but you get to buy them for $100 afterwards in your local shops, or some laws which are really focused on making sure that progressively not only work is taxed, but also money which is working, which obviously doesn't work, but it's just laying somewhere and being more and more. So just a shift in the financial system, which includes CO2 emissions, which includes just environmental destruction, and the social aspect would definitely be my wish if there was a magic wand.
And if I could just ask a clarifier, so, you know, we've had a broad spectrum of views on, you know, the type of system that we need to support the transition. And I guess I'm asking you, do you believe that we can work within the system we've got with some changes and tweaks, or do we have to work outside it? And the way that's been, I guess, formulated by some people is they feel that the capitalist system almost inevitably creates a short-term focus, which puts us effectively in competition with people who are trying to think about a medium or longer term transition to a different type of future.
Yeah, this system change and climate change keeps echoing in my mind when you say that, obviously. And I truly believe that our system right now is going in a very competitive direction. However, I think it's an urgent matter, and it's a matter which just requires also very realistic and hands-on solutions. And in this regard, I feel like the system that we have needs to deal with the challenges we face. And obviously, this system needs to be adapted in a very, very dramatic way. It's a holistic change in every aspect in our lives, but it's also in this unfortunate or in this grid that we have already put upon ourselves. I believe this is, all I have to say in this regard.
Very, very dramatic. I've written it down. Thank you. Okay. Laszlo.
Well, my biggest wish, taking science seriously. That's it. To say some more sentences or thoughts. I think we should definitely decouple interests. So at the moment and in the last decades, we were talking about energy saving with energy supplier. I mean, this is just crazy. And the energy supplier, the local regional energy supplier, are responsible for the energy saving institutes in our regions. they don't want to save energy. They want to sell energy. So I think this would be a very important thing, to have neutral bodies for these important decisions.
Got it. Thank you. Pauline, last one.
Great suggestions or wishes, demands so far already. I think building on that, I'm thinking of taxing the rich or taxing toxic stock market transactions. It can't be that we're just playing with lives or having this new form of colonialism and slavery just through globalization or businesses and toxic supply chains. So I think we should try to, like I think Jasmin said, to achieve climate justice and think more of equality and equity in helping those who are actually suffering, and not those who just have the most money.
Very good. Okay, so thank you everybody very much for all those comments. I mean, I think there was quite a lot of convergence on some points. I think there are also probably some different views which would probably take longer to explore about the extent of, system change required, and even sort of describing that and talking about obviously is difficult because you've got to describe your terms first, etc. But that is that's been probably the biggest area so far of difference, which is not surprising. And in my experience, certainly, for instance, big business find it extraordinarily difficult to think about system change. I mean, it's not necessarily that they intellectually can't understand. Of course it isn't. It's just that their perspective is so born out of the existing system that it requires a contortion to actually think of it in a very different way. So anyway, thank you so much. If anybody wants a final word, put up your hand. He pauses, waiting to see if the hands go up. Oh, Laszlo, he's gone for the final word. Go for it.
Just one word to the passive house standard. I mean, this is really at the very top of science that we have researched and tested and proven over the last 30 years, and this must be implemented immediately and without exceptions on the broad scale. I mean, that what we know from the passive house standard, that you don't have to go for 18 or 19 centigrades in the wintertime. So this is a standard that it's possible to build for the same price or nearly the same price as conventional buildings, and this is proven, and you have a warm rooms, a warm apartment in the building. So this is a concept that you don't have to freeze, you don't have to live without any comfort problems. So you have the highest comfort in wintertime, in summertime. Also summertime, we are talking about how we can cool the buildings if we have global warming. We have to avoid overheating, and this is possible. So we don't need cooling devices with high energy consumption. We have to avoid all these systems because it's possible for nearly the same price. And if it's about 0 to 3% more expensive, you have subsidies in Austria for that. And if you know how to do this, it's even possible cost neutral. So I think it's important to tell the people that it's possible without any comfort problems.
Okay, thank you. And maybe we should apply the passive house concept to the entire system. I'm not sure what that would look like. That would be super interesting. Right. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for what you're doing, by the way. Thank you for, giving people like me hope. And, all that focus, all that effort, that energy, that thinking, that mobilization. We know that we will prevail. It's incredibly difficult. It's difficult times, but people like you are keeping it all going and keeping that hope alive. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you for being with us, and have a very good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sam, for organizing. Thank you.
Thanks for
Bye-bye.
organizing.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.